Welcome, awesome Earthkind people. In the last 2 weeks, over 30,000 people from all over the world gathered in Glasgow, Scotland for the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties, or COP26. They shared heartbreaking stories of how the climate crisis is impacting their homes, communities, and economies. Leaders of Pacific Island nations passionately warned that their lands could soon be underwater from sea level rise. The Northwest US and Canada spoke about this summer's unbelievable heat wave with record temperatures of more than 110 degrees. People from all over the world spoke about uncontrollable wildfires, droughts, floods, tornadoes, and hurricanes. Residents of Siberia shared how their unprecedented 100-degree summer is melting the permafrost and releasing megatons of methane that could catapult the world into a catastrophic exponential increase in climate disruption. Yet, 100,000 people filled the streets of Glasgow with one of the largest climate rallies in history, and tens of thousands of businesses, governments, environmental organizations, and others exchanged ideas for how we can reduce pollution and still snatch victory out of the jaws of the impending catastrophe. I am a New York chapter director for E2, the Environmental Entrepreneurs. E2 represents more than 10,000 business leaders across the country who understand that it's not the economy or the environment. Rather, what is good for the environment is also good for the economy. This week's podcast is an interview with 3 of the many E2 members who are in Glasgow for COP26. They tell the good, the bad, and the sad fact of a world in turmoil and a widespread lack of government leadership. But in addition to the stark realities, the E2 members also share their inspirations and the hope that people throughout the United States and all over the world can work together to create the healthy, clean, prosperous, and just civilization that we all want and our children so desperately need and deserve. If you want to help create real change today, stay tuned to the conclusion of today's podcast to find out what you can do to multiply your climate impact by a factor of 1,000 with hashtag CodeRedClimate and CodeRedCongress.com. Today's podcast is being sponsored by the Power of the Earth with Comfort by Climate Master. Climate Master is a 50-year-old United States manufacturer of geothermal heating, cooling, and hot water systems. Over 1/3 of our greenhouse gases and an even larger percentage of most families' energy bills are from heating, cooling, and hot water. Geothermal uses the energy in the ground beneath our feet to create the most efficient HVAC systems in existence. You're tired of rising energy costs and want to save up to 70% on your energy bills? Go to awesomeearthkind.com and download one of the free special web events that will show you how to get geothermal heating and cooling installed in your home. Now, let's hear from Marilyn Wait, the Climate and Clean Energy Finance Program Director at the Hewlett Foundation, Chris Bentley, the CEO of Good Energy Guild, and Laura Berlin-Shane, Vice President of Blue Planet Systems, as they share their experiences and insights from the United Nations International Climate Conference in Glasgow. And energize!
Hi, everyone. Welcome to E2's webinar, live from COP26, a conversation with E2 members in Glasgow, Scotland. This webinar will be simultaneously translated into Spanish. You can access the Spanish channel on the bottom menu of your Zoom screen. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that you'll be in view and listen mode throughout the webinar, which means that in order to interact with the moderator or the panelists during the webinar, you can use the Q&A function. And if you're joining us by telephone, you could submit any questions or thoughts for the panelists by emailing me, Pearl McLeod, at pmcleod@e2.org. We will have a Q&A period at the end of the program if the time allows. With that being said, I would like to hand the floor to our moderator, Ron Kamen, who will introduce the program.
Thanks so much, Pearl, and thank you, E2, and thank you, Laura, for pulling this all together. You guys are great. And yes, today, internationally, E2 in Glasgow at the climate conference, the conference of the parties, COP26. Woohoo! And we have with us two E2 members. And if we would, I'm going to start by asking you guys to please introduce yourself. Why don't we start with the lady, if you would, Laura? Introduce, whoop, there goes Laura. Laura just disappeared up. She's back. There we are. Hey, Laura, if you would introduce yourself, who you are, what do you do, and why are you in Glasgow?
For the weather, for sure. No, I'm that's a whole other story. I'm Laura Burland Shane. I am one of the chapter directors in Southern California for E2, and I'm also VP of Government Affairs for a company called Blue Planet Systems. We're based in Silicon Valley, and we're a carbon capture and mineralization company, which means we capture emissions and we mineralize the CO2 into rocks that can then be used in concrete, making a negative carbon material. And I'm here really to talk to international policymakers to discuss procurement and how the power of public procurement can generate demand for these types of materials.
Thank you so much. And Chris, if you would. Chris, please unmute yourself. Sorry about that. There you go.
Okay. I'm Chris Bentley. I'm from Boulder, Colorado, and I'm in the Mountain E2 group. I've been a member for maybe 5 years or so. And I went to COP in Paris. That was my first one. And I really had a good time. I learned so much, met so many new connections. There was a bunch of E2 members there and other people. And so I vowed when the fifth one comes around where they're holding people, governments accountable more for what they said in Paris, that I would come. So here I am.
Outstanding. Excellent. And she's back. Hello, Marilyn. How are you? If you would introduce yourself, please, who you are, what do you do, and why are you in Glasgow?
Hi, I'm Marilyn Wait. I lead the Climate Finance Fund. I'm in Glasgow because this is the first COP that's really taking on private finance. And last week, there was a whole day dedicated to climate finance, especially from private finance actors, and that's why I'm here.
Wonderful. And we'll reverse the order a little bit. So if you would, Marilyn, tell us, what are you seeing? What's really happening there? What's your impression about where things are and how things are going?
So sorry, I just see the recording button, so I'm guessing this is on the record. So I guess, what am I saying? There's not a whole lot, not very promising happenings. Perhaps there will be a breakthrough in some shape or form by the end of COP, but right now, not much to report in terms of progress. There is definitely a lot more representation on the outside than on the inside, and that's a problem. And so I would say, last week, in terms of the climate finance pledges, we had 130, we had a number of asset managers, asset owners, and banks come together under an umbrella called GFANZ. the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, but it's not much more than that. So collectively, they have 130 trillion US dollars of assets under management, but that doesn't correspond to the real economy or decarbonization. So they've all agreed at a very high level to decarbonizing, reaching net zero by 2050, but some bank CEOs have said they will use offsets, which is not a real solution. So I'm afraid I don't have much optimism to share with everyone. Maybe my colleagues do.
Oh, sure. I hope so. Chris, why don't you take the next whack at this, and hopefully you have.
I'm coming at it from a little bit different perspective than Marilyn, because I think what she just commented on are mostly the official COP things that are legislatively happening, where, yes, I've been in the blue zone and the green zone, but most of my time has been spent on what they call side events. So like today, I was 7 hours at the Bloomberg Green, which is a subset of Bloomberg. I heard all sorts of CEOs. John Kerry for a half hour was 20 feet from me. CEOs like Patagonia CEO, IKEA, and there's just so much positivity. And I don't know if you've ever heard John Kerry speak. Probably, I'm sure you have, but he is just such an optimist and so wonderful in the things he says. And he's been going to COP since before there was COP. And he said that this one, it really feels different, that there's so much going on with companies versus the government per se. He said that with the government, it kind of waxes and wanes their focus on the climate. We all know what happened the previous administration. And so he's really happy, and I'm really happy from what I'm observing, that there's a lot of private industry, and there's a lot of people like Marilyn that are on the finance side of things that were not always necessarily here in the past. And like Laura with the capturing CO2 and building materials with their Blue Planet, I think that that's been a big subject of it. I saw 15 different presentations today, and I bet 5 or 6 of them talked about carbon capture and building materials.
Excellent. Yeah, John Kerry is a pretty amazing individual. I was the Earth Day 1990 coordinator for the Mid-Atlantic region, and that's where I first came across John when he was actually leading the Earth Day activities in 1990.
Wow.
And yeah, he was just an amazing guy, and just now he's doing fantastic work. So thank you for that, Chris.
Yes.
Laura, how about you? What are you seeing and hearing, and what's your perspective on everything?
Well, for me, it's actually been quite positive as well. I've been intermingling between the Blue Zone, which is sort of the country pavilions, which for me was rather surprising how diverse the crowd was. I mean, each country has their own pavilion with various panels and discussions, and so I sat in on a Colombian panel on carbon trading, price on carbon. I sat in on Tom Steyer came and spoke at this innovation forum that I'm at. But the most important policy piece for me, and it was a very big and promising announcement, was the Global Concrete and Cement Association. They're called GCCA. They made a pledge to net zero emissions from all their member companies by 2050, which is to me incredibly promising. It's I don't know if everyone knows, but cement basically contributes about 7% to all of greenhouse gas emissions. So that was I think that gave me some optimism. The biggest companies were all discussing sharing best practices, and then on the subnational level, I thought it was also a lot of good dialogue. The head of C40 moderated a panel and talked about the promise of job creation, that cities, their projects, their economic development, sustainable projects can generate millions and millions of jobs over the next 10 years. So there's a lot of cooperation and collaboration with the cities. And yeah, the private industry sector, to me, it sounded like a lot of optimism. I know, on the other side, I did take part in the protests that occurred over the weekend. There were, I think, 150,000 people marching, and they weren't very. I don't think they were extremely optimistic about what was going on inside the proceedings. It was mostly demanding more. Basically a just transition. So it was a lot of indigenous representatives talking about the need for the countries, the developed countries, to spend some money funding projects in these, less developed nations that are suffering the most. So it's been an interesting mix. I'll tell you, though, the excitement is definitely, I felt like it was palpable. There's just a lot going on.
Yeah, excellent. So you hit on 2 points, and I'll ask everybody to kind of comment on the second point in particular. But on the first point, yeah, I was amazed to find out that cement is actually the second most sold commodity in the world after water, and that of the 40 gigatons of carbon that greenhouse gases we're emitting into the environment every year, that cement actually is produced at 50 gigatons, and that most of that is actually made up of limestone, which if we mineralize the carbon, we could put it in all the cement and capture and basically grab that CO2 out of the environment now. So in addition to dealing with the cement industry itself, which is a big emitter, do you see promise now that we're going to be taking carbon out of the atmosphere and potentially putting it into cement and other substances?
Well, it's actually what we do is we put it into concrete. We make the rocks, and they're mixed with cement in a ready mix plant, and out comes concrete. So it's really sequestered in the concrete. But yes, there's a lot of discussion about the built environment and embodied carbon, and how do we address that? Because a lot of the discussion and dialogue has been on operations. How much money you're spending, how much of your operating budget, I suppose, is going to electricity that's generated, from fossil fuels. And this gets into, I think they call it Scope 3, which is really gets into your building materials, not just the building operations. So there's a lot of talk about decarbonizing. And as far as the direct air capture, I haven't seen a lot of those companies here, but I did hear Secretary Granholm, Jennifer Granholm, they just launched this. It's called the carbon shot. They've got this hydrogen shot now, and they want to reduce the cost of direct air capture. It's like $1,000 a ton now to $100. So that's promising, because those solutions are still very expensive and aren't going to happen for a while, which is why we're focused on capturing emitters CO2 right now.
Great. So, you mentioned this 150,000 people in the street in Glasgow. There were similar demonstrations throughout the UK and around the world. What's your perspective? And then Marilyn, what's your perspective? And Chris, on how that was perceived, and if that's having any sort of impact on the dialogue and discussions?
You want me to answer that, or would you like?
Yeah, go ahead. Well, go ahead, and then we'll pass it over to Marilyn.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that surrounding, I think that the COP discussions, the negotiators, and they're being portrayed as very elite, sort of, I guess, disconnected from the reality of what's going on, and that's how it was portrayed in this protest. That it was all about just sort of. There was a common refrain, which was tax the rich. So I think they see this as a group of elite. Countries that are really disconnected from the climate disasters that are happening and sort of the climate poverty. But it was a completely, I thought it was very uplifting, honestly, because you did get to hear from the nations you don't hear from, the indigenous people who are connected to the land. So I do think, I hope that we'll have some promising results. I think there's been some good announcements about deforestation, committing to stop deforestation. There was a very good announcement about methane, agreeing to cap methane emissions, to stop exporting coal production. So, I feel like there's been movement, but as Marilyn said, yeah, we'll have to see what the details are here at the end.
Marilyn, back to you. So if you would, the demonstrations and is there a positive twist on things that you see, or is it all really just unfortunately disconcerting and not so great?
Disconcerting and not so great. I think we need two things going forward. One is no more fossil fuel badges. Right? The fossil fuel industry is completely taken over COP on the inside, blue zone. And we need to make sure that every delegation, especially of the rich countries, has a youth delegate. Because they're also on the outside and not on the inside, where it really matters, where it's not getting through. Because as we've seen in the past, a lot of countries can pledge and then they can unpledge, which was the case of the United States with the Paris Agreement. So this needs to be translated into actual regulations that withstand the test of time, and that is not the case. None of this is binding, mandatory, there's no accountability, there's very little transparency. When you do read the fine print, you see that actually there isn't much teeth to anything that's been announced. And so I think going forward into the next COP, if we're going to continue having these international dialogues that are supposed to be about action, then we do need to see some really big changes in how this is done, who's at the table, whose voices are actually heard, because being just on the outside doesn't work.
So what kind of changes would you like to see, Marilyn, going forward for the next one?
Well, as I said, no more fossil fuel badges and at least one youth delegate, especially for the rich countries that are part of the official negotiations that represent the countries.
Great. And in terms of the demonstrations that you saw yesterday, do you feel like they had any sort of impact? Or?
No.
Just weren't heard, huh? Okay. Chris, your perspective.
Yes, I'm getting a little different than Maryland's. I went to the march also. It was very cold and raining when we started, and everybody still showed up. And yes, it was mostly young people, which I was really glad to see that. And as we got about halfway through, all of a sudden the clouds just lifted and the sky came bright, and there was a big triple rainbow that to me was just, and I think almost everybody there, because everybody started screaming and shouting that God is, or nature or whatever is looking down on us. And it just felt so good and uplifting. And I agree with Marilyn that the youth are being shut out of this COP and most every COP. It's been really difficult to get the blue zone passes. For a while, they said the green zone was going to be restricted, not able to get in. So there's been some fringe events, they call them, one group calls them, and side events, and the youth have mobilized and created a lot of their own events. And so I'm really happy for them there. However, I also think that the youth could step up further and louder. And here's what I mean. I was a little too young for Vietnam, but I remember my older friends doing a lot of protesting and marches almost on a daily basis, all over the country, all over the world. Big signs, loud, everybody. When I was in college, it was more anti-apartheid in South Africa. But that was 3 or 4 times a week, big marches. Now the youth of today, you see them out there activating, but given the severity and the scope of this problem, I would be out there laying down in traffic or doing something every single day. I'm going to die of old age. They're going to die of climate change. So, yes, I think a lot of them are really positive, and I think they're looking for solutions more than they're looking for the problems.
Thank you. So we have a few questions. I'd like to open it up, and then whoever would like to jump on this first one, we've got a whole bunch of questions actually. So one question from Mark, thank you, Mark. Is anybody talking about annual CO2 emission reductions that can be tracked by country as progress, so as we're not fooled by the 10 to 30 year goals that may be empty? And today there was an article actually that just came out about how a number of countries are underreporting their CO2 emissions and holding them accountable to actually have sound scientific data. So anyone want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll take that one because John Kerry today talked specifically about that we got to turn this into an annual accounting. And another thing he was really positive along those same lines was before and still currently, there's no real common language as far as what's net zero, what's net negative, what's net positive, what are carbon credits. There's no international standard for carbon credits. They can be all over the map. And the different standards that we have in other types of things like finance are just not there in all this carbon accounting. So he told about a new effort that's taking place to change all that and make a common language that we can get measured by, because you can't manage what you don't measure, but the measurements all over the board. So that's changing. So that's my answer to that question. I'll let someone else.
Marilyn, Laura?
So I can't speak for the country level in terms of the financial industry, so the banks and asset managers. There is a voluntary standard called the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, or PCAF, that is rapidly growing, that's global, that is quite inclusive. However, we need to make that mandatory to have the whole financial system measure and disclose their carbon emissions of their loans and investments on this annual basis. And that is facing resistance by some banks, including like BNP Paribas in France, Santander in Spain. And so these banks are completely getting away with not just maintaining existing fossil fuel clients or climate causing activities, but expanding. They're financing the expansion of more harmful activities from the fossil fuel sector, from the extractive sector, and from all the activities which emit greenhouse gases. So we need to make that mandatory. And right now, there's no economy or no major economy in terms of large GDP that has made this mandatory. There is potentially mandatory emissions disclosure coming from the SEC, maybe by the end of this year, maybe by Q1 of next year, but that is not yet in stone. And at the EU level, there's definitely not that yet. And so that will be a battle to come. But once again, that is not the case. None of that has been made mandatory at the COP or before the COP.
But it should be mandatory soon, eh? We need to have it happen. So that's a great point, Marilyn. Thank you so much. Laura?
Yeah, that's I'd actually like to hear a little bit more about the fossil fuel delegates or negotiators, because I'm very curious about how that works. But yeah, today was an interesting panel discussion. Two people from the same company, it was JP Morgan, and they actually each one of them had completely different perception and beliefs in what was actually going to occur. One woman said, well, we can't live without the fossil fuels, it's going to cause chaos in the energy markets and volatility. And so we've just got to wait till the innovations are there. And then her colleague said, I completely disagree. I think we have to he said the IEA report says that we're not going to get to 1.5 unless we stop greenfielding building new fossil fuel plants and pulling more out of the ground. And so, and he was, I think, he got a round of applause actually. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's a bit hypocritical, sometimes what we're seeing here. I was astonished that they were still, acknowledging that they have to continue the extraction, and it's just can't work.
So, boy, you guys have a lot of different tangents here. So I'm just going to keep going down the list as they came in, the questions, and then we'll kind of come back to some of these points because there's definitely questions around this whole thing. But one question was, can the private sector and companies like Patagonia and IKEA and others in combination scale their efforts to even have a meaningful fraction of what the nations need to do and are failing to do? So what do you guys think about that on the private sector side?
I think the private sector is way ahead of government now. And John Kerry emphasized that again today. I hate to keep bringing his name up, but he was really powerful. And I come here really for 3 reasons myself. One of them is to get inspired. One of them is to get educated. And one of them is to give myself the credibility to go back to the University of Colorado, where I speak to classes on a regular basis, not teach, speak. And I mentor a lot of MBA and Master of Environment students. And I come here to get inspired myself, but also to be able to go back and inspire the students and the young people and get them into careers that have to do with climate change, stopping it or reducing it or rolling it back, and then empower them on how to do that. And that I talk kind of funny because 4 years ago I had 3 strokes, and I'm in a electric cart now, and I can't really walk, but it's kind of like I go back to the students and say, hey, if I can come over here, dye my hair green, travel across the, and just to get educated and inspired with what's new and what's exciting, then you sure can do it a whole lot easier. So let's get started. What do you want to work on? Let's make a plan. What are you most interested in? So what Marilyn's saying about investments, Laura's saying about capturing CO2 and building materials, there's probably 50 different things that students graduating today could go into and focus on. And I always tell them, only think about the next 5 years. What do you want to do for the next 5 years? Because in 5 years from now, it's going to be completely different. And new technologies and new opportunities. So where can you have the most impact?
So Marilyn, you represent, a major company doing, incredible work, and obviously you're there to make an impact. So do you think that the private sector can step up and do something more than the public sector at this point? And obviously we all need to do something, but what do you think?
So I don't represent a company, but more the philanthropic foundation space, just for that.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that. Didn't mean to.
No, we get confused all the time, HP, Hewlett Packard. And anyway, so the question is, can the private sector step up to somehow replace the public commitments that are required? No. The science doesn't support that. Is there a lot of capital that can be mobilized from private finance? Yes. However, we get back to government with regulation, right? So the regulatory, not the legislative part, so the regulatory part is crucial among financial regulators. And from that, we can mobilize trillions of dollars towards climate solutions globally. And that has to be activated. But in terms of, it's an all hands on deck type of problem, right? So we need everyone to be engaged and to take action. So there isn't any one actor that cannot do anything. So we need both. It's definitely a yes and.
Yes, and Laura?
I mean, I come from private sectors, but at the same time, I interact with policymakers and regulators, and so, I agree with I agree with the statement that we need both. I honestly think that leveraging the power of public procurement is critical, particularly in building materials, and there's definitely a lot of inspiring legislation in the U.S. that's happening, and from what I understand, it's even more powerful in specific international cities. I was listening to someone talk from Oslo. The Scandinavian countries are way ahead of us in terms of banning, not selling internal combustion cars, transportation, green building, price on carbon. So, I mean, I do think that we also have to use the regulatory power as well. We've got to start regulating these emissions, and also with regard to setting, 2030, 2050, as you mentioned, we've got to really monitor this, by the minute, really, because we can't just sit around and get back together in 5 years and see how we've progressed. But I do think the transparency problem needs to be addressed. But I also think I've heard some solutions about using AI and satellites to monitor emissions now. So, maybe there are some technological solutions to get to the heart of this.
So there's no doubt that the public sector and setting policy drives a lot of what we do. But on the pressure on the private side from the ESG community and the investment requirements, do you think that's driving a greater percentage of private investment now into the changes that we need? Or is it really, I mean, obviously it's got to be yes and both, but I mean, do you feel like the ESG community is really having a significant impact in making things change?
What do you see, Marilyn? I mean, I honestly feel like there's a little bit of a feeding frenzy going on with in the financial markets. There were all these SPACs that came out and were raising tons of money, and then they sort of flopped. And I hear a lot of talk about investments, and this is the next frontier. But at the same time, I do see, for example, the Exxon board, the board, I think they can have a pretty powerful impact, right? And that's becoming more and more common, I think. But I'd be curious to hear what the other panelists think about this.
So I think COVID-19 was a fire drill for the climate crisis. And what we've seen with that is just how much better ESG portfolios perform. In the past decade, the S&P 500 energy companies, which is code for fossil fuel companies, returned maybe 1%, whereas the overall market returned over 200%. So the numbers are there in support of a climate-friendly economy, sustainable infrastructure, and sustainable companies. So we have all the evidence of the data that we need to take action, and that, I think, we've seen this these proof points during the past 18 months, 2 years, and I think that's part of the story. I mean, there's a lot that's happened before we got to now, but definitely I've seen an acceleration in ESG and climate-friendly thinking in the investment community and pressure points, from in this COVID era, and just the general need to integrate ESG across the board. So I think that's a part of it. But there will always be laggards. There will always be those companies that want to take advantage of, cheap assets, right? A lot of these assets are now cheaper than they've ever been. They risk being stranded, but there's always some kind of financier out there. And so that's why we need the financial regulation to step in, because there will always be a laggard somewhere in the system. And we need to make sure the entire system moves away from the carbon emitting towards the climate mitigating activities.
Policy again. Chris?
I don't really have anything to add. That Marilyn, I thought she did a good job of covering it.
Nice. Excellent. So Kendra says that she's frustrated by the intense greenwashing happening by the countries and companies at the COP. Do we know what percentage of the attendees are connected to the fossil fuel interest? And do we know who else is there? Is there any transparency on that front?
Well, I mean, I haven't seen. I'm not sure if they're banned from exhibiting, but there's definitely no presence of fossil fuel companies in the green zone or the blue zone. But as Marilyn mentioned, they're parties to the negotiation. So I'm curious to hear more about that.
Marilyn?
Well, I put in the chat, I'm assuming that people have access to the chat, just a link to an article that explains in detail the fossil fuel badge problem. Over 503 fossil fuel lobbyists, so more than any other single country delegation, have been admitted to the COP.
Wow. Pretty incredible. And do we have any sense of who else is there? I mean, clearly they're a single biggest presence, but other folks? You've seen a pretty broad cross section of, I would hope, all the renewable folks and et cetera, carbon reduction people, carbon capture. Yes? No?
Yeah, according to all of the speakers today at this Bloomberg Green thing, some of them who've been to 15, 20 of the COPs are saying that there's a whole lot more private industry here, that the climate science is decided. It's no longer a real debate over whether climate change is man-made and caused by burning of fossil fuels. That's passed. And now it's more focused on private industry looking and promoting solutions that they've already come up with. According to the experts, we've got everything we need right now to solve this problem. We just need to scale it up and finance it with Maryland's money, and let's go.
Great. So, one of the challenges that someone just commented on was that even in places like Norway, they're still producing oil and they're still caught up in the fossil fuel, challenges. But clearly that's got to be overcome. So Clint says that it was great to hear Lauren's news from the Concrete Makers Association. Are you guys aware of any other trade associations that are also setting carbon reduction targets? Because those trade associations are often the big roadblocks of climate action, despite what their individual companies may be doing. So you guys have any news on that front besides the concrete industry?
Well, I think there is a focus on. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that there is a big focus now on these hard to abate sectors like steel. There's actually a panel tomorrow discussing what the World Steel Association is doing and their commitments. These same with cement. You can't just stop producing it. It's a building material that won't. They can't stop manufacturing it. We're growing, but trying to think of there's a lot of people here also from various green building councils and their memberships, but I'm not aware of other associations, mostly because that's the focus of my role.
I think there's a lot of local, state, and governments that are, especially the cities, are really putting their heads together and talking about what's working and what's not. and they're making a lot of progress at the local level, sharing best practices. There was a couple of big big groups there today that were talking about how wonderful it's been collaborating and concocting new ideas with others at the city level, as well as steel and some of the building material. Methane from cow burps, that's a big thing that's being addressed. There was a whole presentation today about different things that they're putting on the cows' muzzles to reduce the burps. It's not the farts, it's the burps. And that's what they were really addressing. So there's just all sorts of new good technology.
Yeah, Marilyn, and other associations that you've seen that are stepping up, or?
I'm not sure about trade associations, but there are various convenings around the hard to abate, so chemical, steel, cement. And also there are convenings around agriculture and land use in terms of actual commitments to reduce and action plans that I'm not sure of, and especially trade associations.
Okay. Daisy asks, is there talk at the COP about the importance of the Build Back Better Act in Congress for the U.S. showing our commitment to climate action, and are other countries questioning the USA's commitment because of Congress being slow to act and to pass this large climate package? What are you guys hearing about that?
I think that with the way that Trump was able to come in and just wipe away 8 years or 8 generations worth of progress on this in his tenure, has the world nervous that it could go either way. What if a Republican like Trump gets elected next cycle? Is all this progress going to go away? So that's where it keeps coming back to the private sector and the city, the local governments that are doing things versus the federal government. If I haven't heard anybody specifically talking about the Build Back Better, it's like Biden's trying, but he's pissing in the wind. He's got those Republicans in the Senate that are just, their whole goal is to block every possible thing that Biden wants to do with the climate and things.
Marilyn, Laura?
I've been keeping on the Build Back Better, mostly for tax incentives, tax credits for it's called 45Q carbon capture. And in the past, they've been it's from the DOE, and it's been heavily influenced by the fossil fuel sector and subsidized really this thing called enhanced oil recovery, where you take the CO2 and then you inject it in the ground so you can get more fossil fuels. So I believe that, from what I've seen, and it's not final yet, that's going to be discouraged in terms of much lower credit and a much higher credit for, let's say, direct air capture and sequestration. So that, I've been keeping my eye on that. But yeah, I think it's incredibly frustrating when your own party can't, Democrats can't even agree to unite on any of this stuff. And, in particular, these coal states that clearly have conflicts of interest. And I just find that to be, it's not sending a good signal.
Marilyn, any comment?
I disagree. It's hard to trust any of these pledges coming from the United States, given that it's easy to unpledge in the change of administration. So I think that's what we're dealing with. So we're experiencing the symptoms of not solving for the underlying causes of climate change and what's created this mess in the first place.
All right, Matt. Maureen asks, the philanthropic sector, E2 and NRDC included, have been convening these for years. Are we seeing a shift away from philanthropic investment in climate, or are they more committed than ever? Definitely the more, Marilyn, this is right up your alley, I think. So how's it going there?
So we're definitely seeing more. So the methane pledge was a huge philanthropic effort, especially Larry Kramer from the Hewlett Foundation was heavily involved in rallying the philanthropic community to achieve that initial goal. We have new wealth coming into the space. We're seeing that in all kinds of ways. So I think that's partially encouraging. Of course, the numbers just don't add up though to what we need. So that's part of the climate finance story, is to work on, the $15 trillion we have in our bank accounts in the United States, or the 27 trillion that the Chinese have in their bank accounts in China. Like, that's really what we should be focusing on. But yes, there is more and more philanthropic capital focusing on climate. I think we need to ensure that this new capital learns from the mistakes and the errors, doesn't repeat. We've done a lot of learning, so it doesn't repeat some of the things that we've already tried and haven't worked out. So I think that's going to be important as this new philanthropic capacity comes into climate.
All right, we're going to jump a little bit quicker here because we're coming down to the last 10 minutes or so. So Chris asks, has fusion energy been discussed at COP26 at all?
I can take that one. It's getting a lot of play, that's for sure. Especially Bill Gates has been here most of the time, and his distributed nuclear fusion on a smaller basis that does not have the repercussions of the waste and the leftover stuff. That seems like it's really been put out there, and a lot of people are behind it. One thing that I'm hearing is a lot of people are kind of dissatisfied with some of these multi-billionaires like Richard Branson, Bezos, Elon Musk, spending all this money on their phallic symbols going up into space that could be better spent on doing some things such as carbon capture. If just one of those guys put their efforts into carbon capture as opposed to going and being weightless for 3 minutes, it could at least help the innovation and move the technology down the track.
All right. Anybody else have any comment on that one? No, good. All right. So an anonymous person says, does everyone have to buy carbon offsets to fly to the conference? Anybody know?
I'll tell you one thing that's really positive is that there's a lot of vegan offerings at the conference. I mean, I read a lot about that. I am a vegan, and no one talks about the impact that animal agriculture has. But I thought it was encouraging that there were plant-based offerings. They made an effort.
Good. Alex asks, how the heck are fossil fuel companies parties to the COP26? That must mean they're taking their responsibility for scope 3 emissions seriously. Yes? What do you guys respond to that one? Marilyn,
I didn't even realize they were here. I haven't seen any of them. So maybe Marilyn has.
I'm sure Marilyn has a different perspective, but let's hear it. Marilyn, please.
Well, first, I wanted to answer the first question. I was actually just looking for the link to give everyone more bad news. So there's while there is more plant-based, there's a veggie burger on the menu, things like that. There's been strong criticism at the meat-heavy menu. So I'll find the links and put them in the chat. But like 60% of the menu being meat-based, serving 4-legged animals, which back to the methane comment, the burping and the farts, and so really it's kind of like they've on one level managed to have options, but really it should be flipped, right? The default should be climate-friendly cuisine at a global climate conference, And there should be like maybe one option for those that absolutely have to have meat, right? As opposed to the default is meat, and we have one little option if you want to align your diet with climate action, at least for these, while you're here at COP. And so I'll send around there's been some great analysis. Someone said that it was like serving cigarettes at a lung cancer conference. So sorry. So I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for bringing the bad news to that positive note of having some plant-based options. What was that second question?
The second question was the carbon offsets. Does everybody have to get a carbon offsets when they're flying over there?
I don't believe so. I mean, so my firm does that just on an annual basis anyway for all travel, but I'm not sure it's a requirement. That's a good question.
Yeah. Go ahead, Laura.
It's not
I was
a
just gonna
requirement.
Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Ron, I don't know if you want to ask my daughter any questions for the voice of the youth, but she just finished her test and she's here.
Great, Aspen. So, okay, got Laura real quick. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that give a shout out to there's this conference and it's a side event. It's called Climate Action Innovation Zone. 100% plant-based food the whole entire 3 days. So I think I'm seeing more positivity here.
Great, Aspen. So we're winding up quick, but youth perspective on everything that's going on. Good, bad, medium. What did you think about the demonstration, and what's your perspective on this whole thing?
I think the demonstrations are awesome. What I've been hearing from what I've been in, and I only was able to make it into the blue zone this week, so it's been only a couple days for me in the blue zone, so I haven't spent as much time as some other people here have, but I think at this point we're just really fed up, and I think having this 2-year gap in between has really hurt a lot of progression that we needed at this conference to go forward, because a lot of it has kind of just seemed like we're trying to grasp at smoke to just even talk about that we missed last year. And I think, I think the youth is pretty fed up. I haven't seen many youth inside of the conference, but I've met several people who have come in from Ireland, Shetland, Norway, London, of course, that I met 2 girls last night or 2 nights ago, and they said that they don't have any reason to be here other than marching. And on the first few days, they've just been making a point to walk up and down and around the green zone, because they just want whoever's in the green zone and the people making the decisions to actually know that we're there and we're trying to hold them accountable, whether you can be in the green zone or blue zone and do anything, or whether it just is showing that the youth are here and that we want something done. And I was extremely impressed. There was the Youth Climate March on Friday, which had tens of thousands of people show up. But even further on Saturday, most of the people I saw in the crowd at that climate march was young people. I mean, all ages, even dogs saying enough woof woof, we want action around their necks. So I think that's awesome, but from what I'm seeing this far, I don't see much being done. But like I said, I haven't been in the meetings and the talks the whole time.
Thanks so much, Aspen. So following up on that, one of the questions is, where and how is environmental justice and equity integrated into the proposed pledges with real implementation solutions that will have equitable outcome and climate justice for everybody? And we want to take a piece of that.
Anyone have anything positive to say? Because I won't.
Okay, give the negative spin first, Marilyn, or the reality spin, I guess.
I mean, it's quite clear that rich countries don't care about poor countries. We've seen that with vaccine access and availability. It's the same with climate and all of the impacts. 2/3 of the world's people are Asian and thus of color, and that's not how COP looks. There's a lack of representation across the board, especially in the decision-making seats once again. And so when it comes to equity, I think if we look at Justice 40 in the United States and having that racial equity lens, it would be nice if that were applied globally, especially in this loss and damages section of the Paris Agreement. But it is not. And I think the US is our #1 barrier to really achieving racial justice globally. And that's ironic because this administration has a Justice 40 initiative. So I think we need to apply that lens in overseas finance, in international negotiations, not just for domestically in the US, but also globally.
All right, we're coming down to the last couple of minutes here, so I'd like to ask you each for one major positive thing that you think can come out of this and what we should do next. And so first, a major positive perspective and what you think needs to happen next. Who would like to go first?
I will. I think all the talk about this common language for measuring and managing CO2, carbon credits, all the various things that have been just kind of loosey-goosey is now really coming to the fore. Again, it's not a question of, is there climate change? Is it human caused? Is it because of fossil fuels? There's none of that. It's all about how do we step up and solve this and get the thing going. Let's plan, let's plan, let's plan, let's go, let's go, let's go.
Marilyn?
You want me to say something positive?
Well, you know, it's always good to end on a positive note. I mean, you know, there's no doubt that we're about to destroy ourselves as a, you know, as a civilization. So rather than saying, yep, we're done, what can we do? What's the one good thing that we can get out of this stuff? And what do we do next? So
I do think it's about what's next. Like I said, it really is translating any kind of pledges into concrete laws and regulations so that they're not easily unpledgeable, and ensuring that any future COPs have adequate representation in all the ways, including generational, at the table in the negotiations, and that there is this equity lens. So that's all of these things have to be put in place. And I think a lot will have to happen after the COP, because in terms of actually translating that into national policies, that has to happen after the COP. And I think we have to keep pushing. President Obama came through yesterday and said something along the lines of, you know, stay angry and frustrated. And so I do think we have to stay angry and frustrated. The minute we become too positive or complacent is the minute we lose the momentum and that we don't take enough action.
all right, I'm getting the hook here. So real quick, Laura.
Yeah, I honestly took away, it probably had to do with being at the Sustainable Innovation Forum, but I saw a lot of promising technologies that were attracting funding. I saw, you know, a lot of interest in various types of decarbonization tools, for example, for aviation, for you know, these hard to abate industries. And as far as looking forward, I think that will continue to, regardless of what happens with these national international discussions, I think that the subnationals, the cities, the states are going to continue, you know, to move forward and you know, collaborate and share share experiences. So that makes me hopeful.
Great. Aspen, real quick.
Again, I think just the fact that I met all of these people that spent their own money, most of them were college students, or just out of college, and they spent their own money just to come here and make their faces known, get involved however they can, whether it's marching, whether it's even just going to the green zone, whether it's working at the Youth Climate Hub. And I think that is incredible, because in past years, I don't think we've really seen this as much. I know I have my friends texting me every day for updates, and that I don't think has happened to this extent before. So I think that's something really positive.
Wonderful. I'm so sorry, folks. We're at the end of our time, but I'd like to thank everybody who's come, all E2 members, all the supporters, e2.org. It's in the chat if you haven't done it yet. Thank you, panelists, so much for your time and your insights and everything else. And I will say this, from my perspective, both personally and looking at society as a whole, there is nothing we can't do if we decide we want to. We have the energy around us. There's more power in the air, the water, the earth, and the sun than we could ever use. We need to tap it. We've got the technology. We've got the ability to do it. We just got to decide we want to do it. Policy is key. Our individual actions are key. Step up. It comes from the bottom up as well as sometimes not from the top down. Thank you, Marilyn, for those realistic perspective. I do think that there is hope even despite all the darkness, and without hope, there is no future. So we need to have hope, and we need to keep pushing on. And it's so great. Chris and Aspen, thank you so much. Laura, carbon capture, key. Marilyn, private sector investment, philanthropic investment is key. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. E2.org. If you're not a member, you should be. We need your voice. The business voice is key. Thank you all.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you for joining us today, awesome Earthkind people. Do you want to increase your climate impact by a factor of 1,000? Then pick up your phone today and call your United States congressional representative and both your U.S. senators and ask them to support the federal Build Back Better bill. Build Back Better will create the largest climate protection action in American history. Because so few people take the time and make the effort, our elected representatives interpret the opinion of everyone who calls or writes as representing the views of 1,000 other citizens. Congress will vote on the Build Back Better bill that aims to get our country to 80% pollution-free electricity by 2030 and cut climate pollution 100% by 2050. The Build Back Better bill provides tax incentives for solar, wind, energy efficiency, electric cars, charging stations, and more. And it will finally cut the subsidies for fossil fuels. It will also drive major investments into communities that have been disproportionately hit by environmental injustice. When you make the calls, spread the word via social media by posting images of a large red exclamation point using the hashtags Code Red Climate and Code Red Congress. You'll be joining some of your favorite musicians and celebrities, including the Dave Matthews Band, Dead and Companies, Billie Eilish, Melissa Eldridge, Phineas, Maroon 5, Brittany Howard, John Baptiste, Alex Benjamin, Leonardo DiCaprio, Jane Fonda, Mark Ruffalo, Damien and Stephen Marley, Group Love, Huey Lewis and the News, and many more. When the Build Back Better bill passes, the United States can enter the global climate negotiations on November 1st, with America setting out to cut climate pollution 100% by 2050 and be able to encourage other nations to do the same. If not you, then who? The time is now. Act now, pick up the phone, call your congressional representatives and U.S. senators, and help create a better future for our children and all the 7 billion Earthkind people on the planet. Thank you.